Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly review of news from around the world. And joining us this week from Washington, D.C., Karen DeYoung, who is the associate editor and senior national security correspondent of the Washington Post. Karen, wonderful to have you. And from Brussels, the chief diplomatic correspondent of the New York Times, Steve Erlanger. Steve, great to have you. And from what we know is sunny London, Bobby Ghosh, who is the Bloomberg opinion editor of Bloomberg Opinion. Bobby, wonderful to have you back here as well. Let's start with you, Bobby, and China. The People's Congress met over the past week. This was the time when Xi Jinping was once again demonstrating who's in control, and some big decisions were being made with regard to the future of China, its own projection of where it's going to go, and of course, with regard to Hong Kong. What did the week bring, and how do we think about it?
Well, as a former Hong Kong resident, that was front and center in my mind when the Congress began. But I think we got three very important signals out of the NPC. It is, of course, the big annual set-piece, highly staged event, and perhaps the most important for the international audience, for the world at large, is that China basically brought down its growth projections to about above 6% is what they said. Now, this is considerably lower than what economists have been saying, which is 8.5%. Some people have said 9%. And it suggests that China wants to restrain its growth. It wants to bring its debt under control. There's a signal to provincial governors and across the country to cut down on lavish projects and borrowing to finance those projects. And so there's an important knock-on effect. If China's growth is 6% rather than 8.5%, that has a major knock-on effect on the rest of the world. China being one of the major engines of the world economy now. The second thing that was quite interesting, which is a subset of that, is the one area where there will be no restraint is spending on R&D. And the big number there is that by 2025, China wants to spend, in 2025, nearly $600 billion in R&D, particularly on technology. And that's a big strategic decision. For context, 580 million, which is a target, that's what the United States spent in 2018, so 2 years ago. But it reflects a kind of closing of the gap. And so China's focus on developing its own intellectual property, that's a big goal. And finally, Hong Kong, which unfortunately, for those of us who lived and loved the city, China's sort of complete takeover of every last fragment and every last shred of control in Hong Kong is now complete. They've approved new rules for the next round of elections in Hong Kong, in which only patriots will be allowed to stand. The Hong Kong legislative, which is a rubber stamp body, will now go forward and create the laws that sort of enshrine this. But basically, this stamps out the last vestiges of democracy in Hong Kong.
Karen, Bobby lays out sort of the three big issues that came out of the National People's Congress, maybe summed up by this theme: the East is rising and the West is in decline, as a phrase attributed to Xi Jinping. Next week, Secretary of State Tony Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan are going to have their first meeting in Anchorage, Alaska, with the Chinese leaders, foreign policy counterparts. How do you think the U.S. leaders are preparing for this meeting, given what has happened with regard to China in terms of its growth projection, of course, the critical issue of Hong Kong?
Yeah, they've kind of lowered expectations for the meeting. This is Sullivan and Blinken are going to meet with their Chinese counterparts, excuse me, and basically have said, don't expect this to be the start of a dialogue. This is sort of get to know you meeting. This is Blinken is tacking it on to a trip he's making, his first trip outside the country to meet with the South Koreans and the Japanese. So he's on his way back. He has again said what they always said: we think there are lots of avenues for cooperation, but we're not going to give in on those issues that we really care about and where we think the Chinese are either competitors or even adversaries. Intellectual property, trade, cybersecurity, climate, free navigation. And so Blinken sort of said a lot about this in a hearing this week, and made clear that they are still going to be critical on Hong Kong. They're still going to be critical on the Uyghurs. They still consider it a genocide. So they haven't quite explained how they're going to maintain this critical stance, maintain their commitment to maritime free passage, and also make some progress on all of these issues. They've again said, we're going to work with the Europeans. We're going to, together with the Europeans, we're bigger than the Chinese are. But the European train, in some ways, and Steve perhaps could talk about this, but has sort of left the station on China. They waited for the Trump administration to get together with them to make some kind of trade common front vis-a-vis China and on cyber and on a lot of these issues. And the Trump administration basically didn't do it. And so the Europeans went ahead and did their own, at least a sort of nascent trade arrangement with the Chinese. So I think that, Blinken said, we're going to be very frank with them. We're going to tell them exactly what we think, but I'm sure the Chinese are going to tell him exactly what they think also.
It's you have to wonder why it is, in fact, that they're meeting. If the purpose of the meeting is not to start a dialogue that will be ongoing, but Steve, the Europeans, of course, they do have a dialogue, but on the one hand, on the other hand, they're terribly upset. In fact, they say they regretted the actions with regard to Hong Kong this week. Regret is not the strongest diplomatic word last time I looked, and they will consider to take additional steps. But the Europeans are sort of trying to figure out how to deal with this China that even with lowered economic growth projections, as Bobby pointed out, is still an economic juggernaut that is playing major role in global security and including in European security and economic development. So how are the Europeans looking at the past week, and how will they respond?
Well, they're eager to see, what Biden and Sullivan and really want, right? It's not clear to them. I mean, there's been a lot of language. There's been a lot of rhetoric. I mean, there's been a lot of rhetoric about Hong Kong and the Uyghurs, but as Bobby said, Hong Kong's gone, right? I mean, nothing the Americans and the Europeans are going to do is going to change that. And they know that. I mean, it's like looking at Taiwan, I think one has to ask, okay, does this help Taiwan or hurt Taiwan? It's certainly the end of, two systems. So that's going to bother Taiwan. But how will the Americans, more than the Europeans, to be sure, Americans and their Asian allies, how will they deter China from being too aggressive on Taiwan? I think that's really one of the key issues. And freedom of the seas, which is very important to our Asian allies too. And I think they'll do a lot on that. And of course, as we know, the Americans have kind of revived the so-called Quad with the Indians and the Japanese and the Australians, not notably the South Koreans. But this had gone away and now it's come back and they want to talk about China. But one of the first things they're going to do is work on a big vaccine push, which in a way is a counter-diplomatic push to the Chinese vaccine push. So I think this is kind of interesting. I mean, it's partly soft power, it's partly aid. The Europeans just don't want to get caught between the two. This is what worries them. They see China rising. Its rise is inevitable. It's not a matter of containing China. It's more a matter of managing a relationship and deterring China from doing stupid things. One of the things the Europeans will notice from this People's Congress is Xi talking about a polar Silk Road. That they didn't like the idea of it at all, because more and more the Chinese and the Russians are using climate change to come through the Arctic and to explore the Arctic, and it creates security issues. I mean, suddenly you need submarines, etc., up in the North Sea and the Baltic, right, where you didn't really need them so much before. So everybody's, waiting to see what the words mean. Obviously, everybody wants to deal with China on climate. The Chinese want to deal on climate too. I mean, they don't want to kill themselves from bad air. But the question of finding the right areas of cooperation and the right instruments and the right levers to push so that China becomes, the so-called responsible stakeholder, when in fact the Chinese have their own ambitions. I mean, they do. I mean, their interests are not necessarily our interests, and how we make room for their interests without hurting ourselves or by defending our own interests. It's the big challenge of the next 4 years, it seems to me. It's really important.
Just two things. One is that it's so striking, perhaps more than any other issue, certainly in foreign policy, the difference between the rhetoric of the Trump administration and the Biden administration on China. Pompeo was out there almost every day giving these sort of stem-winding speeches about never referring to China, always referring to the Chinese Communist Party. We need to counter them. We have awakened the world to the threat. This is a major threat. This is terrible. There's no place we're going to cooperate with them. And so that's gone. I don't think the Biden people have quite figured out what the alternative to that is in terms of rhetoric. So I think that this meeting, which is much more a sort of, okay, we need to look each other in the face, is important in that respect, and what they say when they come out of it. The other thing is Taiwan, where the administration, in various hearings and questions from reporters, they've been asked, well, what is your attitude toward Taiwan? What are you going to do? And they've been very reticent and have said, look, we're going back to what the law says. We have one China policy. There is a Taiwan Act. That's what we follow. And so I think that in some ways, again, at least rhetorically, which is as far as we've gotten on any of this yet, that is a sort of saying to China, we're not going to do what the Trump people said vis-a-vis Taiwan.
Bobby, jump in here and also reflect, as Steve did a little bit. This morning, we had the first ever leader meeting of the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, that we never had that before.
Yeah, that's what I was going to bring up. In fact, that meeting ended, I think, an hour ago. We're still waiting for the readouts on that. It was quite interesting that the messaging ahead of the meeting was that this is not only about China. The big headline was this is about coordinating vaccine rollouts and responses to environmental challenges. But that's not fooling anybody in Beijing. Beijing will see this as an anti-China front, and in fact, all the communications out of Beijing has talked about it as a bloc designed to try and stymie Beijing's advances in the world, both economic as well as security. There's a tendency in some parts of the American foreign policy establishment to see the Quad as a sort of as a way, as an informal Asian NATO, if you like, as a way to do exactly that, which is sort of contain China or restrain China. I'm a little more skeptical because I'm not sure that all the members of the Quad are on the same page, which is why the readouts will be very interesting. The Indians They all think of China as being a threat in one way or the other, but there are very important differences amongst themselves. I mean, the Indians are threatening to throw American executives of Facebook and WhatsApp in jail. There are serious problems on the human rights front between the Biden administration and the Indians. The Australians are currently at the sort of sharp end of the spear of Chinese sanctions, but are taking a far more aggressive posture towards them, and the Japanese are somewhere in between. So first of all, I think for the Biden administration to herd even this relatively small set of cats is going to be quite a challenge, and I'm fascinated to see how that plays out.
Well, and we will be able to discuss it next week at our next World Review discussion, when we will also have a better sense of what the meeting in Anchorage, Alaska will be like. But it is a new era. Certainly the rhetoric and the language that is being used is different, but the geostrategic realities are very much the same. A very strong rising China that is challenging some habits of cooperation that exist transatlantically, transpacifically, and in other ways. So an issue that we will continue to watch closely. Moving on, Karen, to our next issue, Afghanistan. The longest war that the United States has been involved in, a civil conflict now, I think in its 40-something year in Afghanistan in one form or another. But some big news being leaked out of all places, Afghan newspapers, came this week about a very different approach coming out of the Biden administration on Afghanistan.
Well, just to sort of lay the groundwork, we all know that the Trump administration, a little more than a year ago, signed a deal with the Taliban, in which the Taliban would break their ties to al-Qaeda, would enter peace negotiations with the Afghan government, and reduce the level of violence. In return, the Trump administration set a deadline of May 1st this year of withdrawing all US troops. And before they left office, they drew down a lot of them, more than they had to under the agreement, and left 2,500 troops there. So the question now is, do you pull them out by May 1st, or do you extend that deadline? They've been very clear saying the Taliban have not met their commitments under the deal, so they have that excuse if they want to do it. But a lot of people in this country say, yeah, get out. What's the point? A lot of other people say, well, let's look at what would happen if we did. The peace negotiations are going nowhere. The NATO allies and other allies who have many more troops there than 2,500 collectively feel like they would be sitting ducks there without US air protection and logistical support and intelligence support. It's pretty much a given that a rapid withdrawal without a peace agreement would mean the Taliban, who have really expanded their reach in the past year, would take over, try to take over, and there would be a resulting civil war. So the administration they've sort of thrown a Hail Mary pass, as I see it. They're frustrated with what they see as the recalcitrance of the Afghan government under Ghani, who wants to stay in power. They're frustrated with the Taliban, who, despite sitting down in these kind of start and stop talks that they've been holding, really haven't given anything and have just made more demands. So Blinken wrote a letter to Ghani and said, look, you got to understand what the deal is here. We have here's our new initiative. We want to invite all the regional partners, including Iran, China, Russia, India, Pakistan, to a meeting under UN auspices, because everybody needs to be involved in this, which is something the regional partners in varying degrees have wanted for a long time, especially Iran has wanted to, they have a long, long border with Afghanistan. They said, we are going to step up leadership meetings with the Taliban and a much more inclusive group of Afghan leadership, which is sort of saying to Ghani, get ready to include other people in the government. It's going to be held in Turkey. assuming it goes through, it'll probably be in early April. And they presented their own long peace plan for an interim government, which would be a power sharing agreement between the Taliban and and not only Ghani. I mean, Ghani has no guarantee that he would stay as president. I mean, the president has to be selected by mutual agreement between the two. The plan sort of looks very suspiciously like a kind of U.S. federal system, a three-branch government with a legislature, a judiciary, an executive branch. And again, at all levels, this would be by agreement power sharing. They would expect this to last for maybe 6 months, a little bit longer. A new constitution, elections, total ceasefire. So they've got 6 weeks to make this work. And they haven't said what they will do, whether it works or not. If it doesn't work, will they withdraw anyway? If it does work, will they extend the troop presence there? Nobody knows. So as I say, it really is a sort of Hail Mary pass with a sort of threat to Ghani saying, you know, you need to realize what we realize, that if something doesn't happen really fast and we get out, you're in big trouble, because we believe the Taliban will then move to take over. So everything's sort of up in the air right now. Khalilzad, who is the US negotiator, one of the few people that the Biden administration kept on after Trump, has been frantically going around the region. He's been in Pakistan, he's been in Kabul, he's now in Doha meeting with the Taliban, and we'll see what comes out of that. You know, some people say, why would the Taliban agree to this? What do they get out of it? The conventional wisdom is that the Taliban realize that if they are in power to any degree, whether it's full power or in a sort of power sharing agreement in Afghanistan, they need to change the way they behaved from last time they were in power, because Afghanistan desperately needs money. It desperately needs support. Foreign governments, particularly the United States, now fund 80% of the entire Afghan government budget. They can't survive without that, and they realize they need to be exist in the real world again. So that's the incentive for them. So again, who knows what's going to happen?
It's a remarkable story, and for those of us who lived through the Bosnia embroil, it sounds very familiar. But that's for another time. Steve, I think Karen rightly emphasized that about 3 times as many non-American troops are in Afghanistan today, and so the question that naturally arises: one, they're mostly European. How are Europeans reacting to this? And by the way, did they know about it? Was this a coordinated U.S.-European effort, or was it old way of doing business? We were doing this, and I'm sorry you had to read about it in the newspaper.
Yeah, well, I think Karen did a wonderful job at summarizing the mess we're in. You think about Bosnia, I think about Vietnam. This feels like Vietnamization that's not working very well, right? I mean, except the North Vietnamese knew they could get support from Russia and China, and I don't know where the Taliban is going to get money from. I mean, I think Karen's quite right. That's the only real leverage that the West has on the Taliban right now, and I'm not sure it's actually going to matter. But yeah, the Europeans are waiting. They're getting tired of waiting. They know it's a problem. There's no good way out of it, but they also know the great line, which is true, is in together, out together. They can't stay if the Americans are leaving. And the Americans have been talking to them. I don't know. I mean, Karen doesn't think that the Europeans are briefed on this letter. I don't know. I'm sure she's right. But they're kind of waiting and getting tired of waiting, because frankly, all they're doing right now in Afghanistan is protecting themselves. There really aren't enough troops to do anything else. So they're kind of hunkered down. There's some training going on, and obviously American power once in a while is in support of the Afghans, but nothing's happening in Doha. I don't know what Turkey's supposed to do with this meeting. I think the Europeans would like to leave. I really do. I mean, everyone says it's conditions-based, so you can make any kind of excuse you want for staying, but there has to be a reason to stay, and there has to be some notion of why you're staying, and that would, is clearly what the Americans are trying to do, which is to create a rationale to stay a little longer and a diplomatic process that might produce a government that Kabul could live with but doesn't like, and would stop the Taliban from going completely overboard the way they're doing. But it does feel a bit like a Hail Mary, I have to say. And it just feels very typical. We're not happy with our allies. We're certainly not happy with our enemies. So we're stuck. And obviously, there'll be embarrassment. I mean, I do think, what we've built there can last quite a while, particularly in the big cities and so on. And there are a lot of Afghans who've grown up who will, fight to hold on to what they have. But there just comes a time where you have to say, we can't stay there forever. It's enough. And I think that's where everybody is, frankly.
Bobby, I think the other notable fact about this new approach is a real attempt to bring in other countries, none of whom may be particularly interested in being brought in, but this UN run, so the UN run rather than US run, great power meeting which will bring the Chinese and the Iranians and the Indians, the Pakistanis, good luck getting them in the same room, and the Russians together, but by the way, not the Europeans, interestingly enough, and then asking Turkey to become the mediator for between the Taliban and the Afghan government. And Turkey's recently its record on mediation is interesting, to say the least. So how do you see this one?
Yeah, I was reflecting earlier when Steve was talking about what I said earlier about herding cats. This is a much larger herd. I'm not sure widening the circle in this manner will be especially constructive. I think every one of those countries will be delighted to be in the room. They will want to be heard, and some of them will use the opportunity to do more than a little bit of diplomatic grandstanding. I can't see how, without a level of statesmanship that is not immediately apparent anywhere, the Indians and Pakistanis who are closest to the scene will agree. The Iranians have an interest, of course. They have channels of communication open with the Taliban, as they have had throughout. But again, it's not clear to me that they will play a constructive role there, especially given all the other many axes they have to grind. The real left field thing for me is Turkey. I don't know. I would have liked to have been a fly in the room when somebody popped that suggestion and how and why that came to be accepted. I mean, Turkey has, even if you go back to the Ottoman era, very little actual connection to Afghanistan. And yes, President Erdogan would love to be seen as an international leader, as a great power being consulted. This will certainly stroke his ego. But the role that Turkey will play is not at all clear to me. Qatar already exists for that purpose. Qatar already has been playing that role for a while, and has developed dialogue with all sides, has a certain degree of buy-in from all sides. Now we have to go and get the same sort of buy-in for the Turks. It strikes me as almost like somebody added Turkey into the picture as oh, well, let's get them in too. And I don't understand why it is. And it does not, for me, speak well of the chances of this thing, because it feels so haphazard and so sort of cobbled together.
think that the reason for having pulling it out of Doha and having a separate meeting is basically to get Ghani to, include other people who don't particularly like him, but have a power base in Afghanistan. Why Turkey? I totally agree with you. I haven't a clue.
Yeah, at least when I was still in Brussels at NATO, Turkey's role in Afghanistan was first and foremost to make sure that the Kabul government interests were understood and projected and protected. So it maybe
they do have troops. They do still have troops there, but
they have troops there, and they are, in fact, they have been in charge, and they've been in charge for the last 15 years of the Kabul region.
Right.
So they, within the NATO structure, they have that responsibility, and it's Kabul in part because they didn't want to have their troops fighting in other places, but also because it has this very close connection to the Kabul government, both Karzai and Ghani, and so the Taliban may not necessarily look to Turkey as an independent mediator, and that's going to be. Right. But we will watch it. Clearly, this region, this country needed some shakeup. The trajectory where policy was moving was deeply uncomfortable for the administration, and I think for everyone else. So maybe sometimes a Hail Mary gets caught. So who knows?
Yeah, I mean, part of what interests me, I covered the Bonn talks when they invented Karzai. Right, when they invented a government. Now they're going to try to do it again, but they don't have the leverage to actually put the guy in that they want. And so it feels very, very, very odd, very desperate, frankly. Anyway.
We'll be watching it. Steve, moving on to the next piece. Your paper this morning has a big story about tens of millions of dosage of AstraZeneca vaccines sitting in AstraZeneca production facilities in the United States. And the White House contemplating a request from the European Union and others about possibly moving those vaccines to the EU or the other parts of the world. Indications are that the White House is not prepared to move any vaccines out of the United States, haven't done it up to this point. It's just one example of vaccine nationalism really taking off. And of course, in the European Union, other things are happening there to make this a big issue. How is the discussion in Europe going on the particular issue of the AstraZeneca stores that are in the United States, but also how is Europe thinking about providing the necessary vaccines to its own people and indeed helping the rest of the world to get theirs?
Well, this is a very, very odd, deeply political story when it should be about everybody's health. I mean, the fact is, the world won't be safe till everyone's safe, but that's not the way politicians think, or it's not the way they're acting. The bizarre thing about AstraZeneca is not even approved in the United States yet, so it can't be used. So what the Europeans are saying is AstraZeneca's screwed us. They've promised us zillions of doses, and they're going to give us about 20% of what they promised us. So can't we have your doses at least on loan, since you haven't approved them? Let us use them since we have approved them, and then we'll AstraZeneca gets more production. And I gather the White House is thinking about this, but it's not really going very well. It's just not going very well. And in Europe, you have people's reputations on the line. There's a fight between the European Union and the UK. Boris Johnson has, in a way, so far salvaged his political standing, even though a lot of people have died in Britain and people feel they made a lot of mistakes in the early part of the virus by churning out vaccination and doing it very, very well, and all praise to him. So that's turned his political reputation around, at least for the moment. But the Europeans are deeply embarrassed because, they bought all this stuff in bulk the companies haven't delivered, they didn't buy enough, they didn't sign enough, and their vaccination programs have been very slow getting going. Each state has been different. And part of the problem has been, as I said, supply. So the Europeans keep saying, well, we've been exporting all this vaccine made in Europe to other countries, millions of doses, including to Britain, and we should stop that. But of course, the vaccines are made in Europe, that's true, but they belong to the companies, and the companies have contracts. But Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the Commission, her reputation is being damaged by this. It's become deeply political. And then you have some countries like Hungary or the Czech Republic who've had a lot of disease, frankly, who have just gotten fed up and for all kinds of reasons, sometimes ideological, have decided to try to get Russian vaccines and Chinese vaccines, even though actually they're much more expensive, oddly enough, than a lot of the American and European vaccines. So it's become, I mean, if it weren't about people's health and lives, it would be pathetic. I mean, now in a way, it's an ugly kind of, to me, an ugly insertion of politics into something that needn't be quite so political, but people's reputations are at stake here. And there is European resentment. I mean, the Biden administration is supposed to be their friends, their pals. I mean, it's not like they're asking for anything terrible, but for Biden too, I mean, he's bet on showing the country that he can deliver vaccinations by July, he says, right? So he doesn't want vaccines leaving, and I'm sure they're counting on AstraZeneca being approved so they can actually get people vaccinated. So generosity ain't there, that's for sure. Not even to Mexico, not even to Canada. And why? Because basically it's about politics, in my humble view.
Bobby, there is of course the intra-European play in where you are between the UK and the European Union, within the European Union, and then between them and the United States. That's one part of the story that Steve has pointed out. There's the other part of the story that the Chinese and the Russians are using the vaccine as a means to enhance their standing. It's not clear how the U.S. and Europe are responding to that.
Yes, exactly. The Chinese, the Russians, and the Indians are using this opportunity to
Well, I think sure it plays a role, and you heard Biden say almost as an afterthought in the big speech he gave last night that as soon as we take care of all the Americans, we're going to be sending a lot to this COVAX program to distribute around the world. But I think Steve is absolutely right. There is no other issue in this country, as far as the Biden administration is concerned, than stopping the pandemic. That is the be-all and end-all of economic recovery, of political saliency. That's it for them. And I think that while they're aware of all these other arguments, they know who's mad at them, they know that nobody's safe until everybody's safe. But I think that until they know that this is assured and they can keep the very large promises that they've made, everything else pales in comparison. I think my colleagues are absolutely right. It may be that they never use the AstraZeneca vaccine, assuming it gets approved here, which it probably will. But they don't want to be in a position of sending anything anywhere until they're absolutely confident they have what they need here to vaccinate everybody. And part of it is persuading people that your government is taking care of you. The more people they get vaccinated here, the more people will want to get vaccinated here. They still have a problem with at least a quarter of the population saying we don't want it. So again, I think you just have to realize that that is it for this administration right now.
Yeah,
And nothing else rises to that level.
I would just add, if I could, just one thing. I mean, we understand, I mean, it's about opening the economy, right? I mean, if you can get enough people vaccinated, then the economy starts to grow again and growth explodes and people start buying and unemployment goes down, blah, blah, blah. So, I mean, it's not irrational to want to get to this point. It just feels very ungenerous, that's all.
Sure.
Bobby, we have a few minutes left, and I just wanted to, I know you got a column coming out on the Pope's visit to Iraq, really a remarkable visit in so many different ways, both from a religious perspective, of course, the homeland of Abraham, but also a papal visit in the middle of a pandemic is something different.
Yeah, the symbolism was sort of was rich and deep, and it provided the Iraqis a rare moment of a rare piece of good news. I mean, and it sort of for 4 days that the Pope was there, Iraqis seemed to come together in the recognition that this was a good thing, and all their many different quarrels amongst themselves could be put aside. His meeting with the Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani was a very big deal. This is the first time Sistani has met a religious figure from the West. In fact, he rarely meets any Westerners at all. It's also a signal, if you like, to Iran, a recognition that Sistani represents the Shia religious faith rather than anybody in Iran, which Iranians will not be best pleased with, but the Iraqis are very happy. But now Iraq has to go back to the world that existed before the Pope got there, and we're already seeing a return of these squabbles and quarrels that had been set aside. I'm not sure that the general sense of national good feeling that prevailed for those 4 days will last very long. Remarkable for the Pope to have taken the risk, but that's the kind of guy he is. He's shown himself willing to do that, but again, as someone with very strong connections to Iraq, it was nice to see that for a few days everybody was able to look upon this visit as something positive.
Well, if Iraq does come together, even in the aftermath, and maybe the next move for the Pope is to go to Afghanistan and figure out how to bring those warring factions together. And if that happens, we will be discussing it on World Preview next week or whenever it happens. This has been a terrific discussion. DeYoung, Steve Erlanger, Bobby Ghosh, thank you so much for joining us this week for really a great discussion on so many important topics. Always great to have you. We wish you all a great weekend, and to our listeners and watchers, the same. All the best, and we'll see you again next week for another edition of World Review. Thank you.
Thank you.